Hi everyone and welcome to 1013 CCJ Introduction to Criminology and Criminal Justice. My name is Wendy Broxham. That is my email address on the screen there. Hopefully we'll get to meet in person this trimester after spending 1.5 trimesters online. So hopefully this trimester I'll get to meet you all. So let's get straight into it, into our first lecture. Okay, I want you to make sure that when you're listening to the lectures, you've got your slides open. They're available as a PowerPoint straight below where it says learning content. So you can listen to this and you can have the slides open so that you can make notes or follow them. The main reason I want you to do this is because there have been a couple of small changes in the slides in relation to things like a YouTube clip address changed, or information about assessment. Now, because these changes are only minor, for me to change them in the lectures means re-recording the whole lecture, which takes a lot of time. So it would be better if you could just make sure that you follow the slides as they are on in the PDF form or in PowerPoint form. Okay, so that's purely the reason to save having to record the lectures all again. And because I was learning how to do recordings when I first did this one, that's why I'm doing a live one now, because there wasn't one. I had to redo it. All right, so let's get into the content. First of all, let's go back to the first one. I want you to think about the criminal justice system. What do you know about it? Do you think that it actually is a system, or is it a sum of many parts, or is it all different parts working independently that sometimes have to come together? Do you all know that one armchair expert who knows everything and doesn't mind telling you all about it? You only have to go onto social media and you'll find all of the armchair experts who know everything about everything. And we all know that expert means X as in has been and spurt as in drip under pressure. So just make sure that you don't listen to what all these armchair experts who are not informed have to say. And at this point in time, that may actually be you. You might have an understanding about the criminal justice system that is going to change through doing your studies and learning about what's actually going on. So we're going to go on a journey all about the criminal justice system, and hopefully it's going to enlighten you along the way. Okay, so let's jump straight in. I mentioned about a system, about the 3 parts that make up the criminal justice system, and that's what we're going to talk about first. So the first part of the criminal justice system that we're going to discuss is the police, because they are the first part. They're the decision makers. They need to decide what kind of crime is this? Was this a murder or was it something else? They are responsible for the detection and prevention of crime, the maintenance of public order and provision of emergency assistance. And would you believe that just as I've started talking about the police, there's a siren outside, although I think it's an ambulance rather than the police. All right, so we've got many, many different parts of the police, but briefly you've got your patrol officers, who are the rapid response, preserve the crime scenes and make arrests with sufficient immediate evidence. The detectives then may come along and investigate crime and initiate prosecutions. And then you've got your specialist squads. There's the traffic, the drugs, fraud, homicide, and there's many others which we will talk about in class. Or you could actually write some down now. See if you can come up with all of the other different squads that are out there. So just pause for a second and see if you can come up with a few. I'd also like you to think about the contact that you've had with police. Was it good or was it bad? Have you seen them recruiting in public? If we have the Royal National Show, the Ekka, this year, the police always have a stand there. They go into schools and talk to young people. So they're out and about, both recruiting and getting to know their people. The next part of the criminal justice system is the courts. So the courts adjudicate cases brought before them, hear the evidence and make decisions on guilt or innocence. So as you'll learn in a lot more detail with Greg in police courts and criminal law, we have different levels of courts. The Magistrates Court is the basic court, and this is where you hear summary offences, which are not really offences that are serious enough to have to be heard before a jury. So they're called summary offences. And committal hearings. And a committal hearing is where a case is made as to whether the person before the courts needs to go to a higher court and have their case heard by a jury. So that is what a higher court is, which is your district and supreme courts. This is where these indictable offences and appeals will be heard. So an indictable offence would be something like murder, manslaughter, rapes, assaults, things that have to be brought before a jury. And if someone is appealing a sentence, that also goes to one of the higher courts. Then you've got your many specialist courts. So they deal with specific offences or offenders. So we've got drug courts that just deal with drug offences, Indigenous or Murri courts that just deal with Aboriginal people, juvenile courts that just deal with juveniles and are coming under a lot of fire at the moment with all of these juveniles stealing cars and running rampant in our community. We'll talk about that a bit more throughout all of the courses that you do. But another one that isn't mentioned there is domestic violence courts. And at this point in time, we only have one domestic violence specialty court in Queensland, and that's down at Southport. There are at least 2 more coming. One's going to be at Beenleigh, and I'm not sure where the third one is. I can't remember just off the top of my head. But these are courts that deal specifically with domestic violence cases. So they are able to offer rehabilitation type services as they can in all these other courts to offenders, but they can also put victims in touch with community services to help them either moving house or putting in place orders against offenders, things like that. There's a lot of information out there. So have a think about any contact that you may have had with a court. Who is responsible for the court? What happens in the court? What evidence needs to be heard and what decisions are actually reached in a court? And I would highly recommend that if you haven't ever been to court, that you make some time and go and sit in one and just have a listen in a magistrate's court. Very easy to do. I went in at Beenleigh and sat there, and apart from the security that you have to go through to get in, you can just go and sit in the back of the court and listen to the offences coming through. I sat in a court that was hearing cases for first-time offenders, and it was just a great big long line going out the door with people coming in one after the other, either represented by some sort of legal support or not. And the police prosecutors just had this massive pile of folders with all of the cases in that they were presenting to the magistrate. So it really is very interesting. So we do have a court hierarchy in Australia. So if we start down at the bottom in the yellow section here, these are your local or magistrates courts, and this is where the bulk of cases in Australia are heard. It is absolutely massive, the number of cases that go through the magistrates court every year. No jury, the magistrate makes all of the decisions about guilt or innocence and gives out the penalty. In the state section, we go on to district courts and the Supreme Court. So district courts are in all of the big cities outside Brisbane, and in the Supreme Court is in Brisbane. I think some of the bigger centres, maybe like Townsville, will have a Supreme Court. Okay, they hear cases where there is a jury involved. So these are your more serious crimes that are committed here. And these all go up to the High Court of Australia sitting at the top. Commonwealth courts are not run by the state, they are only run by the Commonwealth government. You've got the Federal Court, Family Court and the Federal Magistrates Court. And the High Court of Australia sits up the top here. So the High Court of Australia has 7 judges. They never ever listen to cases where there's a decision of guilt or innocence to be made. They simply make decisions on whether a case has been presented properly, so rule of law, whether the law's been applied properly in a case, and they can also make decisions based on the Constitution. So to give you an example, when Gerard Baden Clay was found guilty, his legal team appealed and it came back to charge of manslaughter rather than murder. The government then took that to the High Court of Australia. All they could rule on was whether the ruling to downgrade it from murder to manslaughter was the correct one, and they decided no and reinstated the murder charge. They didn't make any ruling on whether he was guilty or innocent of anything. They're only listening to issues around decisions that have been made in law. Okay, the third part of the criminal justice system is corrections. And the role of corrections is to maintain prisoners in custody. That's what they do. So this is very different to a divorce hearing where custody arrangements are made. This is all about maintaining prisoners in secure facilities and managing them. There's also offenders who are on community correction orders, so they are outside of prison, but corrections still needs to undertake looking after those people, so offenders still need to check in. It is managing their punishment in the community. But what I want you to think about is, what are we correcting? So I want you to think about this, because we're going to be discussing this throughout the course, because sentences are not always custodial. We have things like probation. We have things like halfway houses, and we have things like weekend detention. So what is it that we're actually trying to correct? Let me just turn over the page here. All right, so is it really a system? Is it a system where everything works seamlessly together, or are they three different parts that make up a system? Well, in Australia, it's thought of as legitimate. This is our legitimate system. But what is something that is legitimate? Well, it is authority and support. And we, the public, make this contract. We all make this contract that we'll all agree, for example, not to murder people, as it is thought to be for the greater good. So we all have this contract that we're going to hand over the ability to arrest people and make them pay in some way for committing a crime. We've handed that over to the criminal justice system. We have like a social contract. In the Bible, it talks about an eye for an eye, and this is what is known as retribution. So it means that a person must pay for their crime with an equal or proportionate punishment to the crime committed. But we've all come to this agreement as a society to not exact our own revenge, but to leave that to the criminal justice system to do that for us. And occasionally we will hold referendums, because the state creates the rules and the group, which is us, make the rules in the first place. So in 2018, for example, it became legal to use marijuana in California if you're an adult. A referendum voted it in. Similarly here, we had a referendum to vote on the same-sex marriage. So everyone voted for it, and the law has now changed. But is this really a system? Do these parts work together? Or are they like a hair care regime where you've got individual components competing with each other? Because shampoo and conditioner don't do the same thing. They do totally different things, but they work together to give you nice, soft, shiny hair at the end of your shower. Have a think about if you caught someone trying to break into your home and kill you. Would you trust the police to come and help you and do the right thing? I would like to think that we would. And I do believe that in this country, we could trust that the police would come and do the right thing by sending forensic people out to dust for fingerprints, or, see if they can find DNA left behind, do a proper investigation. But what if you lived in Iraq or Syria or a place like that? Would you also trust the police, or would you be more inclined to try and take the law on yourself? So the laws in this country are deemed to be fair. And when we pay a fine, we're saying that. We are indicating that we believe that the laws in this country are fair. Who are the other players? Well, we've got the Director of Public Prosecutions, which is the Crown, and they represent the government or the state in prosecutions of indictable offences. So that is the prosecution in a court case. We have legal defenders, solicitors, barristers, lawyers. We've got youth detention centres, 2 of them in Queensland, Cleveland Youth Detention Centre in Townsville and Brisbane Youth Detention Centre at Wacol in Brisbane, on the precinct out there where all the prisons are. So they go to juvenile detention and they come from the Children's Court. We've got welfare and advocacy groups, so domestic violence campaigners, child abuse campaigners, drug abuse, victims' rights, and they're all there just around the outside and the periphery of the system. But have a think now about the issues that we're currently facing in the juvenile justice area. And they are huge at the moment and they're ongoing. This isn't a new problem. So the criminal justice system brings offenders before the courts for adjudication, and at the end, if the person is found guilty, they are sentenced. Now, they have to be punished. That's what our law states. And there's a number of aims of sentencing. Retribution, which we've briefly touched on, restitution, deterrence, incapacitation, and rehabilitation. So let's go through all of those. So retribution is said to be an eye for an eye, giving you a punishment before you did something wrong. You did harm, so you need to have something proportional to the harm that you caused done to you. Now, going back a long time ago, if someone, killed a child, the child's family would have the ability to take a child from the offender's family and kill that child. Proportional harm to be dispensed. Restitution is a financial settlement, and this is simply paying compensation to a victim. Restitution, while it is a sentencing objective, it's not one that you will discuss in an awful depth going across your studies and into the university, but it's important that you just understand it. Okay, deterrence. This is a really big one and comes in 2 parts. So we have a specific deterrence, which might mean that a punishment that's given to a specific offender is done to try and deter that specific offender from offending again in the future. Or we have what's called general deterrence, which is a group of people, so us as a community, see what punishment a person receives, and that will deter us from committing that same crime. Okay, so to put that into context, why don't you park where there is a no parking sign? Because you know what the consequences could be as far as punishment if you do so. The same with speeding. Speeding fines are getting really up there. So why don't people in the main speed? Because you know what the fine is. Why didn't you just kill the last person who pissed you off? Because you know the penalty, and they're very good at catching killers too. But what if the penalty was only 6 months in prison? Do you think that that might make you want to go and kill the last person that pissed you off? Incapacitation is simply removing the person from society so they can no longer commit crime. So if someone is incapacitated, then they simply can't go out and commit any further crime. Sending a child to their room is basically the same sort of concept. And rehabilitation. And this is where we make the decision that the offender has basically got something wrong with them. So we are going to do something to address their underlying issues to modify their behaviour. How good are we at doing this? Not always very good. And what are we trying to fix? Are we trying to fix their mindset? Are we trying to fix the way they speak to people, behave? Often it's a drug addiction, so we're trying to fix the addiction. Sometimes it's anger management, and we're trying to fix their anger management. So what 2 theories, and you'll learn a lot about theories in the next few years while you are studying, but where do these sentencing objectives fit in? Well, retribution and restitution belong to what's called ethical formalism. So you did wrong and you deserve to be punished. If you murder someone from my family, then I will kill someone from yours. It's the old biblical saying, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Okay, so that is known as ethical formalism. Deterrence, incapacitation and rehabilitation belong to the utilitarian philosophy, and it relates to stopping future harm. So deterrence is associated with classical and rational choice theories of crime, and we're using the punishment as a utility to stop future behaviour or purpose, and the higher the punishment, the more you will deter them, according to the theory. Okay, so the one way that you can think of this is that retribution and restitution are very backwards looking. So they're only looking at the crime that has been committed. They're not interested in the offender at all, and they just want simply to punish the actions of the offender. Utilitarian philosophy is very much forward looking because we are looking to stop future harm. And in doing this, to stop future harm, we're looking more at the offender than we are at the crime that they actually committed. And you'll go into this any number of times in coming years. So don't get too hung up if you don't quite get it yet. We'll definitely be going over it. This is just a little mind maps for those of you who are very visual, to look at the steps that occur after a crime has been committed until it gets to the stage of punishment. Now, don't get too hung up on this. This is just something to show you what's done in research. But your car gets broken into, you discover the crime, you call the police, there's an investigation, the person's found guilty or innocent, they go to the court, they do their punishment, they'll come out of the court, be out of the system forever, or they'll go on to commit further crime. But you can see that there are heaps and heaps of steps that go between the crime and the punishment occurring. All right, so Sare is actually an Australian criminologist, and he argued that there is no such thing as a criminal justice system. They're more like factories, three little factories that operate independently of each other. And you can move between them, but they're not connected. They've got different jobs to do and different goals. So the word system is used very, very loosely. So there is a separation of powers. What is the separation of powers? Well, it's to stop one person or group holding a monopoly and becoming, in effect, judge, jury, and executioner. So they each have their roles as discovered, as alluded to there. So police gather and present the evidence, courts consider that evidence, and then corrections can carry out the sentencing decisions made by the courts. And just have a quick read of these. Which of these are breaches of separation of powers? Okay, every single one of these is a breach of the separation of powers, because one is trying to intervene or interfere in the job that another is doing. You can't have one person or one group responsible for everything. Just doesn't work. So in Australia, criminal law is largely a function of the states. In Australia, we have 9 criminal justice systems, so one for every state and territory, and then we have the Commonwealth or federal police, okay? Unfortunately, not every state has the exact same laws, so you can have a different experience depending on what state you happen to be in, but we have no uniform Australian criminal code. As we've seen from COVID, the states very much like to do their own thing, so I think that any discussion in having a uniform code would cause the states to, or the governments of each state to probably argue very, very strongly against things that they wanted in there or didn't want in there. But going back to the fact that we've only got 9 in Australia, let's compare that to one state in the US, which is Texas, which is where MIESA comes from. They have 300 different agencies just in the one state in the US. And all of the states are the same. They've got multiple different agencies. So every town will have their own little system, then their little part of the state. And then in Texas, you've got like the Texas Rangers. So 300 different agencies just in the one state of Texas. You can understand then how people like Ted Bundy, and before we had computer systems where people could communicate much easier. They were able to get away with their crimes because they would just move to a different jurisdiction and the jurisdictions wouldn't talk to each other. So this is why it made it so easy to move and commit these crimes in the US. So what are the demands on the criminal justice system? Keeping in mind that we're talking here about them processing people. Well, we want them to protect our community. We want them to control crime, prevent crime, enforce the law, endorse the law, so make sure you stick up for what's actually in the law, recognise the victim, which is not something that has always happened in the past, protect the rights of the accused, which may sound a little bit funny, but remember they're only accused, they haven't been found guilty. But we also want them to punish, rehabilitate and incapacitate. Can we do all of these? And do we do these well at all? We're really, really good at incapacitation, but how well do we do at prevention? Think about what's going on with juvenile crime at the moment. How well are we doing at preventing it? Can we do all of these things at once? And is there one of those functions of the criminal justice system that you think is more important than the other two, or are they all equally important to each other? So you are now new consumers of criminology. I need you to start questioning what you see and read. Don't be sheep and don't believe everything you hear. Question everything. Ask why. Agree or disagree, but don't be a sheep. For next week, I want you to start watching and listening to the news, particularly news stories and how they're presented to you and the language that they use. So that's your little bit of homework for next week, is to start looking at how crime is presented in the media. We're nearly finished. So the system is quite often misunderstood. Many people don't understand the complexities of it and the aims of it. And that's why we're seeing so much public outcry and criticism at the moment, especially when it comes down to juveniles. So we need to keep in mind that each of these parts of the system are independent and don't work with each other. They build upon each other to get to corrections at the end, who also have their own separate job to do. But the judicial system runs on what is given to it by governments. So we need to make sure we remember that in the background. And the outcome of the system looks like a funnel. And here is your funnel. So at the top, we've got lots and lots of crimes that are committed. A much, much smaller number are reported to police. Okay, I'll just go from the funnel to the next page so you can follow it. No, I won't. I'll come back. Okay, so for every 1,000 crimes, about 400 reported. 320 of those will be officially recorded as offences. 64 will be cleared up, 60 by arrest. 43 persons will be convicted and only 1 will be in prison. So less than 0.1% will end up in prison. And these numbers do vary by country and are largely symbolic. This is for all different types and severity of crime. So if you look at that, you've got 600 crimes that are not reported. And we're going to talk about that in coming weeks. Why won't people report crime? Do they just think it's not serious enough? Do some don't even know that they've actually been a victim of a crime? These are not exact statistics. So they're going to look very different based on different cultures or countries. So think about where we should spend our money, because at the end of the day, it's taxpayer money, it's our money, and what resources we should be spending it on. So to interpret the funnel, lots of crimes are reported, much smaller number punished. It might indicate that we have an inefficient system, a waste of resources, not punitive enough, something the community is always calling on to make punishment more harsh. Or it might indicate that the system has a high burden of proof. So it's not up to the person who's been accused to prove that they didn't commit the crime. It's up to the prosecution to prove that they did. And we can have a very high burden of proof. The system can be compromised through the use of parole, good behaviour bonds, concurrent sentences, suspended sentences, statutes of limitations after which a person cannot be charged. Suppressing the names of juvenile offenders, very huge issue at the moment, and a person found guilty but released without conviction. Okay, so the community can believe that fairness has been undermined when these things happen. I'm not going to go into what all of those different things are because you'll probably cover a lot of that with Greg in police courts and criminal law. If you specifically need to know, please don't hesitate to ask. Last slide. So changes in one arm of the system can have a significant impact and unintended effects on the other arms. Think about, for instance, police doing a crackdown on certain offences. So they might set up a sting on catching drug offenders. Catching lots of people is going to cause a backlog in the courts because you've got to get these people through the courts. And I can tell you that from a friend of mine who actually works as a correction officer, they are almost running at double numbers at Brisbane Correction Centre at the moment, to the point where they're having regular call outs for ambulances for fights in cells where people are getting seriously injured, because they're now triple bunking them in cells that are meant for 1 or 2, because there are so many people going through the system at the moment. There is a new prison being built out at Gatton, but it's not due to come online for another 2 years. The problem with building new prisons is something I want you to think about. If we build new prisons, because Brisbane Correction Centre is not closing down, we're just building a new one, how does that impact on what's going to happen in the court system if we've all of a sudden got new prisons? Okay, so one of the reasons why a lot of these juveniles are not being put into youth detention at the moment is simply that the detention centres are overfull and they don't have anywhere to put them. So that, again, we saw recently where we had young people in watch houses, which was highly inappropriate places for children to be, but there was nowhere else to send them. So these are some of the issues that we have in the criminal justice system. All right, I'm going to stop talking and leave it there. That is a longish one to start week 1. I don't normally make them as long. I've broken them up into mini lectures. But thank you for listening through, and I hope to meet you all in class on Thursdays. Bye for now.